Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Standing Committee on Public Accounts. Today is November 10th, and as per usual, I'll start with our mandate and our statement of purpose and values. The mandate, the Standing Committee on Public Accounts is charged with matters concerning the public accounts of the province, the annual report of the Auditor General, and fiscal management. Statement of purpose and values? Sure, we're just going to take just a short recess. All right, sorry about that. We're going to reconvene. So we just had a slight AV issue, and so we're back. So I'll start from the beginning again. Today is Tuesday, November 10th. This is the Standing Committee on Public Accounts. And as per usual, we always start with our mandate and statement of purpose and values. The Standing Committee on Public Accounts is charged with matters concerning the public accounts of the province, the annual report of the Auditor General, and fiscal management. Our statement of purpose and values. The Standing Committee on Public Accounts is dedicated to improving public administration in partnership with the Auditor General. The committee examines the administration of government policy, not the merits of it. The committee strives to achieve consensus in its decisions whenever possible. Members take a nonpartisan approach to the work of the committee. So I'd like to thank everybody for being here today. We have Carol Bellringer, Sydney McEwen, Gord McNeely, Robbie Henderson, and Corey Deagle all present today. And we have Hannah Bell joining us as well. And my name is Michelle Beaton, and I'm the chair of the committee. So today I'll ask for an adoption of the agenda first of all. Thank you, Gord. And today, I've been looking forward today for quite a long time. So this is a training on the actual blue books of the province, so the public accounts of Prince Edward Island. And we actually have joining with us today members from the Canadian Audit and Accountability Foundation. And so it is an honor to have Carol Bellringer, who's the president and CEO, and Lesley Burns, she's the director of Oversight. And they're joining us through Skype today or via all the COVID measures that we have to use at this time. But also joining us in the House with this morning is Shawn Murphy, and Shawn is the former chair of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Accounts. So very excited to have you all here with us today. This is a public meeting, so this training is accessible to Islanders as well, which I think is also a very exciting point, and it's great to be able to share this knowledge with everyone. So we'll start off with presentation, and I will hand it over to Carol and Lesley. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back working with your committee. You've done great work since the last time we met, which was shortly after the committee was formed. You may already know from the article that the foundation published how important and appreciated your committee's commitment to cross-party collaboration is. But we're not alone in feeling that way. Recently, your committee's chair was invited to deliver a presentation to members and staff of public accounts committees across the Commonwealth at a Commonwealth Parliamentary Centre United Kingdom conference. This is a great accomplishment. So Islanders are in an enviable position, and keep up the great work for the entire committee. Today, we're here to provide some insight into reading the public accounts. But before I do that, I'm going to just give you a little bit of background on our foundation for some of you who are new to us or don't remember the finer details of it. We've been around for 40 years, and we provide research and support to both audit offices and public accounts and oversights committees, municipally, provincially, federally, territorially, and internationally. We receive support from the legislative audit offices across Canada, and our international work, much of it is funded by Global Affairs Canada and we're currently doing work in Rwanda, Senegal, Guyana, and Vietnam through that program. Our objective today is to support your committee while you plan your review of the upcoming public accounts and the audit opinion and related commentary. This is a part of the committee's oversight role, and in too many places, it's one that's overlooked. We've often heard that these documents are downright scary. And to convince you that they're not scary, even for non-accountants, we have the Canadian Audit and Accountability Foundation's new CEO, Carol Bellringer. I feel very lucky to have her with us. She comes all the way from Victoria today, so it's quite early. She's worked directly with dozens of public accounts committees throughout her career. And obviously through that has a lot of audit experience. She began as the city auditor in Winnipeg. She served as the Auditor General of Manitoba for 2 terms, and most recently was the Auditor General of British Columbia. So since this is a workshop, I'm just going to start off before we hand it over to her, and I'm going to ask each of the committee members to share with us what one word you would use to describe a hearing specifically on the public accounts.
Carol Bernard.
Accountability.
Sydney McEwen.
That's a good question. Openness.
Great. Gord McNeely.
Long.
Rob Henderson.
How about detailed?
Corey Deagle.
Confusing.
Good. Hannah Bell.
Complex.
And I'll choose informative.
Lesley, you're muted. Are you going to follow that up?
Over to you.
Okay. Well, one of the things we often say after we hear the reaction to the public accounts is there's often somebody saying scary or something like that, and we heard a little bit of that. And I really hope that today I don't just make it even more confusing. So it is complex, but it is something that does complete one area of accountability, and the openness of your committee will make sure that it works. So thank you for that. So next slide, Lesley. I'm not going to read this quote out loud, but if you just have a look at it. I have to tell you, I was an Auditor General in Manitoba the year that George Morfitt issued his report on the public accounts in British Columbia. And he led with this quote from Charlotte Bronte. And so this was 1993. And I have to tell you, as an Auditor General, there weren't many as poetic as George Morfitt back then. But I'll say that it caught my attention, and I have thought about this quote many, many times since then. A lot of the media attention is often on performance audits, and they point out problems in a colorful way. So that can mean that some of the tough stuff is overlooked by the media. So much of the audit work and the accountability documents on public accounts are not riveting to the general public, and they slip by. And that's where your committee can make a real difference scrutinizing these very important documents. The public accounts documents, so the financial statements, are backed by complex accounting standards. Tough decisions are made in putting them together. A significant amount of the Auditor General's office's time is spent verifying those financial statements. So if it helps, the professional accountants like myself, the rules are complex, they're hard to interpret, and for non-accountants, it can be daunting. So having said that, they're the starting point for many other discussions. They're at the heart of economic decisions, assessing financial performance, and policy positions. The statements themselves are policy neutral. They give you the facts about what has occurred, and it isn't until you compare the results to the plans, the budgets, that you should know whether or not what happened was what was expected to happen. The policy call of whether or not you should balance the budget, whether you've chosen to run a deficit or build up a surplus, are policy calls. They're not included in the financial statements, but you do need reliable, comparable financial statements to get those policy decisions made. So we're hoping that the workshop will help you with your understanding of these documents. And most importantly, I've tried to lay out a few interesting areas in a way that will give you the opportunity to turn the pages yourself. And I'm going to make you find things. And hopefully that will help you get more comfortable with where things are so that you can most effectively use that information going forward. And as Charlotte said, something real cool and solid lies before you. Next slide. So this is a quick process document, just what we're, the process that you would go through as a committee as it relates to basically any hearing, but I'll speak to it in the context of the public accounts themselves. So first, it's important to identify the key documents. I'll go through what those are in a minute. And then from those documents, extract the relevant information. We'll also go through that. And third, prepare for your hearings. What will you focus on? What questions will you ask? That kind of preparation. And we'll start to talk a bit about some of the things you might ask in the context of the public accounts. And then, of course, holding your hearings. I'm not going to go through best practices for overall committee operations today, so I won't be getting into the usual practices of asking ministries, and it may be the Comptroller General in this case, for action plans or preparing your own report or any follow-up of recommendations. I will say, and Lesley's already mentioned, practices do vary amongst public accounts committees in Canada in general. And as it relates to the public accounts as a subject area, the practices are quite different. Not all public accounts committees do scrutinize the financial statements. And if the Auditor General issues a report about the financial statements, they do generally have that report on their agendas. Some will link the two. That was the case in Manitoba when I was there. And some will only, so in the Manitoba case, they would, and it was a hard copy, their volume 3 was like this wide, and they would have all of these documents stacked up in front of them. It was before it was all electronic. So that would be the most common practice when there is a look at the public accounts themselves, is to do it in conjunction with the Auditor General's report on it. So it's something for you to think about going forward, an area where the Auditor General's recommendations about the public accounts sometimes do get lost. They aren't always followed up the same way as other performance audits, because the Auditor General is going in every single year and doing an audit of the financial statements. So they do commonly issue an annual report. And so there is no need for the Public Accounts Committee to intervene, if you will, and make sure that it's followed up. It does tend to get followed up every single year when it, as it relates to the financial statements. The performance audits, contrasting that, are one-offs, and they aren't generally going back and auditing the same thing year after year. So I will point out, the Auditor General in Prince Edward Island has been issuing a full annual report, so a single document, and one chapter of that is on the public, or several chapters touch it, but on the public accounts, it's a section of their annual report, and we'll walk through that today. So the next slide, please. So there are two basic sources of documents to consider in the hearings on the public accounts. So one is the government's financial statements themselves. Included in that statement in volume 1 is the independent, oh my goodness, sorry, my document just closed on me and doesn't want to come back, but I'll get that sorted out in a second. Included in the statements, and so this is volume 1 of the public accounts, and we'll open these documents in just a minute, is the auditor's overall opinion on the financial statement. So it's about 1 or 2 pages long, sometimes longer if there's problems. It's in a standard format, and it tells you whether the statements are presented fairly. It tells you whether they've been prepared in accordance with Canadian accounting standards for the public sector, and those are different from the accounting standards that are used in a public company. So the report itself, the audit report, is going to look the same as any auditor report that you see in a public company statement. It's actually an internationally consistent format these days, but it does have components to it in that 1 to 2 pager that also explains management's responsibility as preparing the statements and the auditor's responsibility to verify them. The accounting standards that are applied in the public sector are the same across Canada. They are applied in all jurisdictions against those same standards. It does mean within Canada, you can compare the results, and they are consistently prepared every year and over time. But it is a caution to look at that auditor's report, because if the statements are not prepared in accordance with the standards, the auditor will point it out. Now, in my case, that was the case in British Columbia and Manitoba in certain years. It is not the case in Prince Edward Island. I'm not gonna get into the differences between Canada and international. I mean, one of the international factors that's interesting to know is some countries are still on the cash basis. So in other words, if you throw your invoices into the bottom drawer and you haven't paid them yet, you just don't put those on the statements. That's not the case in Canada. It's what is referred to as full accrual basis. So if it relates to what's occurred, you will see it in those statements. And there are differences as well with the private sector that are quite a complex set of differences. The standards themselves do evolve, and they improve. So there is some, when you go year over year, you will actually find out that there have been some changes to the accounting standards, and therefore there are some things that have to be reconciled if you are looking at year to year. How come it's different? There was a big year when Canada moved to a full accrual basis, and a lot of organizations that had not previously been consolidated, so included, and I'll talk about consolidation in a minute, started to come into the government's financial statements, and previously they had not been considered part of government. So those you have to be alert to those sorts of changes, and the auditor's report tells you quite a bit. While we're talking about the government's public accounts documents, so item 3 and 4 on the slide, you will see right after the auditor's opinion, you will see number 4, you'll see the financial statements themselves in volume 1. And usually in front of all of this, of the report, is a more fulsome, what was referred to as a discussion and analysis. So the financial statement, FSD&A, is you're going to get a lot of acronyms thrown at you when you start to hear about financial statements. Don't let them scare you. Financial statement discussion and analysis is just that. This is a set of financial statements for PEI, and PEI you have 3 volumes, and again we'll just flip through those later. Everything that I've just talked about is included in volume 1. That's the audit opinion, and the statements have been audited. I'll run through the rest later, but they get into things that are not audited and of a different nature. So in the second point on this bullet is the Auditor General's report. In PEI, as I mentioned, it's a chapter in the Auditor General's annual report rather than a standalone document. And it tells you the story of what the Auditor General found during the course of the year's work on auditing financial statements. So next slide, please. and I'm gonna just pause for a second and ask you. I'm not sure how I'm gonna know where you're at with this. So I'll give you a minute to just take those two, get a hold of those two documents. I'm assuming you have them paper copies. Some of you may have it electronically. And if you just try to find in the public accounts, the auditor's report. So the one or two, it'll be signed by the former Auditor General, and it's around page 20. There's your hint. And just look for that one page in the public accounts. And the second thing to look up is in the auditor's annual report. Open it up to section 10. So you'll see the paragraphs are all numbered, and you'll start to see the paragraph numbers around 10. So just those are the places in these reports we're going to end up going back to as I walk you through some of the key areas to know more about. Okay. Next slide. Is there someone in PEI who could just say, oh no, I suppose we're trying not to go sound back and forth. I just will assume that someone will say something if there's any problems going through all of this.
Yes, I'll do that for you, Carol. If there's any questions or anything that arise, I can do that. Otherwise, we'll just hold them, I think, till the end.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. And that was very helpful because all of a sudden I realized I've been talking for quite a while, and so far I can only see the slides and Lesley. So it's good to know there's people at the other end. So thank you for that. Okay, so over the next 4 slides, I'm going to walk you through the Auditor General's 2020 annual report, which is based on the province's public accounts for the year ended March 31st, 2019. So the first point is, you can follow along with this if you like, but I don't get you working really hard for another slide or two. So in the first of all, the audit opinion, and I've mentioned that it's in the public accounts document in front of the statements. It's a really good thing that it's a clean opinion. It means, and I've heard that you have never had a qualification in PEI. That is not true right across Canada. So something to be proud of in terms of the strength of your preparation of financial statements. Some of the highlights in the 2020 annual report include quite a bit of information that the auditor has put into the report that summarizes the results themselves. That information is derived from the financial statements. If you look at section 9.11, there's a mention of the results for the year being a surplus of 57 million and a reference to the fact that that compares to a budgeted surplus of 1.5. Same thing for net debt, and then getting into some of the references as to how those results compare to gross GDP, gross domestic product, how they compare per capita, and so on. I'll get a little bit more into what those measures are all about when we turn to the government's reporting. Next slide, please. So continuing through the Auditor General's report, in sections 11 and 12, the auditors described how certain transactions were not recorded in accordance with the accounting standards. If those differences had been big enough and they had not been adjusted, the auditor would have qualified the audit opinion. So it's a bit of it's therefore not that bad, but it is something that is not in line with what you'd expect to see, and the auditors pointed it out to you so that you can ask some questions and figure out if it's important to you. You know that that is the case. In 1014 of the auditor's report, there's quite a bit of information about the recording of leases, and in 1015 some information about liabilities that were not one was not a liability and some were not on an accrual basis. So back to that, they weren't reflecting the full amount. And as I say, the basics of accrual, I always did use that example of if you can put your Visa bill in the bottom drawer and not pay it and then not record that, that means you haven't accrued it. So it is that simple around accruals, but the complexity of recording things on an accrual basis is, an example of that would be pension plan liabilities, where you're starting to look at all kinds of actuarial valuations and so on. So getting there is complex, but once you know what it is, the recording of the accrued liability has been done for you by the by management, so by the controller, and the auditor has said they did it right. So that's the I'm on 1016. I'm just actually going to ask if you're following along, please turn to 1016 of the Auditor General's report. And that is one of the first recommendations that the auditor has made. And it's on page 123, if you're looking for it. And it's a comment that the Controller's Office should ensure that transactions are recorded in accordance with public sector accounting standards in the preparation of the consolidated financial statements. And it's referencing all of the various things that I just listed here that the Auditor General's gone into in some detail. Next slide, please. So if you could turn to paragraph 10.18 in the Auditor General's report, and again, I'm just highlighting and not going through the details of some of this, but contractual obligations, I'm going to walk you through all of the numbers within the financial statements that touch the issue of debt. And contractual obligations is one area that you want to consider in the context of debt. They are not included in the debt numbers. They are obligations, things you are going to have to pay in the future because of contracts. You're locked into them. And in a minute, I'll go through the financial statements and we'll refer back to contractual obligations and why they're important. So the auditor's telling you some of the information in that note on contractual obligations needs to be adjusted. And the auditor is also telling you in that paragraph that the Controller's Office made those changes. So these are not errors that are existing in the statements as you see them, but it is letting you know that in the process of getting those statements done, discussions take place, changes get made, and in this case, it was. So I'm going to go now through the debt numbers, which is going to take you now over to the public accounts, volume 1 of the public accounts. So if you go first to page, now I have it as page 21. The page numbers at the, like I've done it, I've got it electronically. The page number on the bottom for me is 31, but the page itself at the top of the page is 21. And it's the heading at the top of that page is the Consolidated Statement of Financial Position. So if you go to that, one thing to mention is in volume 1, the statement that the auditor has put an opinion on, it is a consolidation of all government departments, agencies, boards, commissions, crown corporations, anything where the accounting, the government controls the financial and operating policies. The government controls them in different ways, and that word control, it's an accounting definition. And I will tell you, over the years, we've had many, many discussions with organizations that don't like to be considered controlled. And they say, it can't possibly be the case. But the accountants have a whole set of standards that determine what is included and what is not. And the wording they use is control. So it does get included if the government controls the finance and operating policies directly or indirectly. It can be because you have legislation that says they have to do certain things. That's government control because it's gone through legislation. So looking at that consolidated statement of financial position, go down through the liabilities first. So we'll talk about the liabilities for 2019. So the total liabilities is now you're going to read 3,242,874. Top of the column, it has a bracket, 3 zeros. So add 3 zeros to that. So we're talking billion, not million. So while you're here, in the financial asset section, you have a bunch of things, including cash and receivables and so on. And the difference between those two things, so the difference between the liabilities and the assets, is your net debt. So your liabilities are greater than your financial assets by just over 2 billion. And that's been invested to a large degree in capital. So if you keep going down the statement, you'll see tangible capital assets of just over $1 billion. And the difference is your accumulated deficit of just over $1 billion. The format of this statement is very different from what you will see in a set of financial statements in a publicly traded company, for example. So it is one of the biggest differences in that case. I'm going to go back to the page. Now, by the way, the slides aren't going to change here for a while. I'm walking you through the numbers in the statements. So if anyone's having trouble following in the statements, please someone stop me and we can make sure you know where you're at, because it's important to see these things. So going back to the debt, if you note on this statement on the left-hand side of each item, there's a schedule reference. So we're going to go look at the schedules. The top of the page, again, back we're going to turn to another page, is showing page 63. And as I say, in the electronic file on the bottom, it shows 73. And it's a page of schedules 7 through 10. So I'm going to turn to page 63. Again, we're in volume 1 of the public accounts still. I have to do this slowly or my system crashes. Sorry. Oops, it crashed. And it gave me an error message. Okay, I'm going to try to do this without having it in front of me. So hopefully you didn't crash and you're on schedule. It's page 63, the reference to schedule 7 to 10. So it gives you all the various breakdowns. One of them is deferred revenue and credits. Let's take that one for example. And you'll see motor vehicle registry, finance PEI, health PEI, and a couple of others. And the total there is $14,537,000. And that's the section that's telling you certain revenue already came in, they received it, but you haven't earned it yet. So they've set it aside. It forms part of the liabilities. You'll see a section on payables. On the next page, you'll see the obligations under capital leases. Loans payable runs, I think, 3 pages. And at the end of the day, you've got the total of the liabilities showing in the schedules. Important to know what this does not include. It does not include the debt from your crown corporations. It does not include the contractual obligations, that note that I was referring to before. So those are future obligations, but they're important to know because you're locked into them. And it does not include contingent liabilities, which are things that you just don't know whether or not it's going to happen or not. So I'll walk through those. So first, the contractual obligations. So that's in note 9. And there's a schedule breaking down. If you go to note 9, so now notes are different from schedules. You've got the statements themselves. You'll see next to the words in the statement, it'll reference the note. So it'll take you to the note. And the references to the schedules follow the notes. So the note 9 is something that you're going to find out about the contractual obligations in there. So following the statements, find note 9. Oops, I missed it. There we go. It's on page 33. And there's a schedule there breaking down the obligations by year. So over the next several years, these things will turn into liabilities when the terms of the contract are met. So as I say, they're not included in the liability number, but they will be in the future. And then if you look on page 59, just one sec. The breakdown of the supplementary financial information. So this is going to tell you the Crown information. So what debt is included in the Crowns? If you, sorry, I'm on page 40 something. So I'm looking at page 59. There's quite a lot of information here. And if you go on the supplementary financial information, look at liabilities, you can see the total liabilities that relates to the various, these are called government business enterprises. So I'm gonna now talk, okay, so that's the debt conversation. While we're into this whole, into this schedule, the government business enterprises are recorded differently from all the other agencies, boards, commissions, and so on. Everything is fully consolidated line by line, but not if you're a government business enterprise. So in here, you'll see two numbers on this schedule. So I'm still on this page 59, you'll see a line that says Province of PEI's equity. And over on the left-hand side of that, it says 218, we're in millions. Sorry, that was the 2018 number. 2019, 243,034 million. I'm not going to make you do this, but if you go back to page 21, you can do it if you want. If you go back to page 21, you'll see that same number popping up on the statement as the equity in the Crowns. So it shows up as one line. And in the same page 59, there's a reference in there to revenue or loss from the GBEs, the government business enterprises, and it's 64,740,000. If you go back to page 22 of the financial statements, you'll see that is the single number that's going to show up now in the revenue line. So for those Crowns, and they're explained in the note to the statements in the very first note as to what constitutes one of these. Think of them as the major Crowns, and you pick up only your equity in it and only the net income or loss for the year. You don't see it broken. Like if you look at the debt numbers, it doesn't include that debt of those Crowns. You can get that information, but it is not included in all the various line by line items except for those two parts. Okay, so I thought I'd skipped something. I did want to walk you through. I turned my page over the wrong way. I was going to go and explain the GBEs, but I'm gonna not do that. If any of that is something you'd like me to get into further later on, please ask. And in the meantime, I'm going to move on. That was an intensity around walking you through two things: the debt and how the Crown corporations are picked up in your statements. So obviously the statements are a rich set of information, and I'm happy to walk you through any other aspect of it when we get into the questions. So next slide, please. Um, all of this, oh, sorry. I did skip a slide. Pardon me while I just this is where it's like it's only 5:30 and it's 6:15 already. I didn't miss anything here. We just didn't talk about it in the same context. So it took me 40 years as a veteran accountant to figure out exactly how all of your statements fit together. So don't hesitate to ask your controller or your auditor general how it all works in terms of the details if you're not finding things and you're not figuring it out. There's a slide. If you could go back a slide for a second, Lesley. The management letters, I just want to tell you what those are. The Auditor General is issuing a lot of detailed information to the various organizations that they are auditing that are highlighted in their report to you. So in Chapter 11 of the Auditor General's report, they do a lot of the financial statements of the individual organizations that are consolidated into the main public accounts. And if they find anything in there, they alert management and they let you know in that report. And they did find some things that were compliance issues and some internal control weaknesses and so on. And the expectation would be that those organizations would fix those things. And if there was a problem doing so, again, the Auditor General will let you know. Okay, so I'll move on to the next slide, and we'll talk about now what all of this means in the context of policy, and it in the both the Auditor General and your Volume 1 of Public Accounts gives you a lot of information in the discussion and analysis section about 3 types of measures, and this is what they are. They are measures that are now, they've been used for probably, 30 years or so across Canada, fairly consistently, but they're not a standard. They're not like you must record them, and they are done in the same way, but they aren't all, if you look, there's more to choose from than just these. And sometimes there'll be a tendency to not show something if you don't like the results. So it's important for you as the Public Accounts Committee to look at what measures are being included and really think through whether or not they're giving you the full picture. One thing I've seen over the years is if you don't like the percentage you're relying on federal transfers, maybe that measure won't be included in the package. So it is important to take a look at what measures are being disclosed. Okay, go to the next one, please, Lesley. And in the Auditor General's report, again in that Chapter 10, there are comments on those same measures. Your Auditor General last year reported that she was calling for better explanation and points out that there is guidance available through the Public Sector Accounting Board. So that was where, in terms of those measures, where that comes in. And there's a recommendation to that effect. Okay, next slide, please. So just to go back again to, there's a lot of information being provided to you. If you have all 3 volumes in front of you, if you want to just literally flip through them for a minute, we talked a lot about Volume 1. So those are the main financial statements. Over time, and Manitoba was slow to adopt consolidated financial statements, and that was one of the places for years I was having to issue a qualified audit opinion. They produced their core government or just the department information as a standalone general use financial statement. And so we pointed out to the public that that was not the full picture. But some of that information is very important for you to know. And so you have a volume 2 of your public accounts that does include more detailed information. It has not been audited. It's in support of the consolidated financial statements, but you do have to be cautious in using them to recognize they're a portion only of the whole. Another big portion of the consolidation are the individual financial statements of separate they're not, some of them aren't so little, but of separate organizations that are built up into the consolidated financial statements, and that's your volume 3. Next slide, please. So now it's time for a hearing. So you've got it all. You've been through all the documents, you've extracted the things that are of significance, and now you're at a hearing. It really is no different from any Public Accounts Committee meeting. There are some references in your members' handbook to the asking questions of witnesses. My tip at this stage is it's absolutely critical, just like any performance audit that you're having a hearing about, is to read the report. Read the auditor's report. And I would say, in the context of the public accounts, the auditor's report will help you walk through the public accounts themselves. The public accounts are daunting, they're huge, there's a lot of information there. If you want to figure out what to focus on, the Auditor General has already done that for you in highlighting those things that he or she believes should be brought to your attention. So that will help you develop some specific questions, and you can determine what witnesses to invite. For the most part, the controller will be the person with the answers. There may be, for example, those management letters. You may say, you know, I want to know more about what actually happened in that organization, and you may need a witness who represents that organization. The controller will not be in a position to answer all of the detailed questions for all of the organizations that are rolled up into the consolidation. So it's important to work through which witnesses you need for your meeting, depending on what questions you have. If it's about the statements themselves, it's the Controller General. If it's about the activities and controls that need to be put in place, in general, it's the Controller, but specifically take a look at what organization it may be impacting. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go through all these questions. I've left you with 3 slides, this one, and if you will, the next one, please. Some for the Auditor General, and the next slide, please, for potentially for the Controller General. These are just examples when I was reading through the documents of what jumped out for me as things I would want to know if I was going through. Now, Lesley, just go backwards, please, to the first of these 3. The first thing that with this, and again, it's a question, in going through it, it would be interesting to know why the surplus was better than budget. And in my view, that would be a question of the controller. I do believe the auditor does have an explanation in the audit report, but at the same time, it's not the auditor's job to prepare the statements or be accountable for the results. So I would ask that question of the controller. And you may turn to the auditor after you get the answer and say, was there anything else that came to your attention that you think I should maybe take into account? But at the same time, that and things like, why did net debt go up? And they've got all of the different measures, as I mentioned, the net debt to GDP, the debt to capita, and they've got all of the trends showing. Great question. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? And there are a lot of those that it shows a decline, but that's actually a good thing. So important to understand what they mean at that level. And the last question was the total liabilities decreased. Why was that? And as already mentioned, the other components that should be brought into account. What about them? What about the contractual obligations? Are they going up at a skyrocketing pace, or have they actually flattened out? So that's the end of the formal presentation. And I'm thinking that we're now going to hand the microphone over to Shawn Murphy. And I will mute myself now.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. I appreciate you taking us through that. And Shawn, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I'm very pleased to be here. I want to echo some of the remarks of Dr. Lesley Burns. I want to congratulate, like her, this committee. You've really been doing a great job. You're actually held out as a model to other provinces, and just keep up the great work that you are doing. I'm going to make a few comments basically from the vantage point of a previous member of a Public Accounts Committee. And what I've done, I've just made a very short 6-page presentation. I didn't put it on a UBS stick. I'm just going to circulate it. I will go through it very quickly. This contains just a few suggestions, ideas, just from the vantage point of a previous chair of a Public Accounts Committee, and some thoughts and some suggestions. And the first point I will make is that you all are aware of this, but really we have to remind ourselves each and every day that really you're fulfilling the foundational role of a member of the Legislative Assembly, and that is to hold the government to account. Every opposition member and government member has that foundational role. Your role is to approve taxation, approve, modify, or reject legislation, taxes, approve the spending of money. But at the end of the day, you are also there to hold government to account, and we've all seen here in Canada and around the world, if that accountability is not there, some bad things can happen, and they usually happen very quickly. And this, going back to the public accounts, this basically is the end of the accountability loop, which starts with the budget, the estimates, the supplemental estimates, and then the accounts are done, the auditor comes in, the statements are audited, and that is presented to the Legislative Assembly. And everyone is aware, but we have to be reminded each and every day that the Auditor General is an officer of the Legislative Assembly, is appointed by the Legislative Assembly, and answers to the Legislative Assembly. There's no line authority between the Auditor General and government. So the next point I will make, it's common sense. I've seen, and you think those are thick, you should see the federal ones. They're that thick. But having said that, to be an effective member and dealing with the public accounts, there is no substitute for preparation. You have to prepare. You cannot go in and wing it. Nobody in this room is an accountant. I'm not an accountant. I've seen people try, it doesn't work. So, as your mother probably told you many years ago, if you have nothing to say, don't say anything. So you have to prepare. There's no substitute. Put the work in, and I'm not talking days, but I'm talking hours to read the not everything, but the basic concepts of government financial reporting, and read the narrative, some of the issues that Carol mentioned, the trends, the sustainability. Just understand the basic concepts. The next point, this is some suggestions I'm making. You might think they won't work, but as this committee evolves, and again, you're doing tremendous work, you may want to consider trying to get additional resources to help you specifically with the public accounts, some accounting resources. Not a major expenditure, but for a debriefing. One of the challenges this jurisdiction has, it's a small jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. Ryan is the clerk for how many committees, Ryan? Three. To give you an example, the federal committee would have a clerk and 2 researchers for this one committee. So you're at a different scale, but you may want to try and get some additional resources on this specific issue. And again, if there is an issue, and some of these issues can become complicated, I set an example. The whole issue of pension obligations is I find an extremely complicated area where they're dealing with the discount rate and a whole number of factors. But it is, and it could be, a fairly major obligation of the government. You may want to get, and again, don't ever forget that the whole Office of the Auditor General works for the Legislative Assembly, and this committee is the interface between the Auditor General's office and the Legislative Assembly as a whole. Again, the next page, I'm not going to get into this. Carol went into this much more qualified and much more detail than I did, but you look for trends, sustainability, ratios, she talked about that. You look for any off-balance sheet obligations, guarantees, especially loan write-offs. Look for any what you can see as out of ordinary expenditures. A couple of suggestions for an effective committee. You stick to the auditor's report. Don't get into policy and other things such as that. But also important too, you stick to the time frame of the auditor's report. When I look around, I think Mr. McHugh and Mr. Henderson were the only, maybe Ms. Bell, were the only people elected when this auditor's, the events that were being audited was done. This is the fiscal period ended March 31st, 2019. So, but that is the focus of the audit, that time period, that audit, those financial transactions. So it's good to stick to what is before you. It's the temptation is always there to something that's going on right today, but that's just going to confuse the matter, and the Auditor General is probably not going to get into this particular discussion. One thing that, and this is another suggestion, that you could do this at another meeting, but you always want to have the dialogue with the Auditor General as to how he is getting along, and you'd want to ask him, are you getting access to all relevant information on a timely basis? That sometimes is a problem, that the Auditor General cannot get information, or if he is getting it, he's not getting it on a timely basis. Are all agencies, Crown corporations, and departments, are they cooperating fully with the Auditor General? Does the office have the resources to do the work required of it? Things are getting more complicated. We've entered COVID financing. The Legislative Assembly is asking the Auditor General to do certain things. They're doing it federally, provincially, and maybe the office doesn't have the resources to do what is being asked of it, and that's a discussion that the Auditor General, it's difficult for that office to have that discussion with the executive, but you people can amplify that discussion. You can ask him if his independence during the previous year has been challenged. So these are issues that you want to consider when you're having this discussion of public accounts with the Auditor General. The last few point here, Crown corporations and agencies. Again, I would recommend you may want to consider looking at some of them. You can't get into everything. It's just too much work. But what I would suggest you might want to consider is, as part of this process, calling in a couple of the Crown corporations. And we're not in any way looking for scandal or problems, but just ask them how they're getting along. Go over their financial statements, any challenges that they see with the entity that they operate. That certainly would indicate that you're keeping an eye on them. A lot of them probably have not been subject to a performance audit. They don't have any interaction with the Public Accounts Committee, so I see no problem in calling them in. And it could be it's most likely will be a very friendly meeting. They'll present their financial statements. They can tell you what they're doing, if there's any challenges, what risks they have. But it's good to have that interaction between those Crown corporations and the Legislative Assembly. Now, I do know that, one more comment here. I do know that there's always been an issue in Prince Edward Island with some of the Crown corporations not getting their financial information on time, and I think the committee is dealing with some of that. In my opinion, that is unacceptable. It's hard to excuse that if you're in business and somebody tells you you're the owner, or if you're the board of directors and somebody tells you that they're too busy to do financial statements, or they don't have an accountant, or some excuse like that. That would send, in my mind, a lot of red flags up in the air. I would amplify that problem. I would suggest that you amplify that problem. And if you do not get a good, wholesome explanation, call them before the committee and just find out what the problem is. There may be a valid reason. You are entering into a period now with COVID that people are working from home. There is some real challenges out there, but this has been going on for a while in this province. So I would take a very firm view on some of these smaller Crown corporations and agencies that are not really doing their financial statements on a timely basis. So that's just some suggestions from a former member of a Public Accounts Committee. Again, I want to repeat myself and congratulate you people. You're really on the right track, and I think, and a lot of people are watching this committee, and I think thank you very much for your great work.
Great, thank you, Shawn. So first of all, on behalf of the committee, I'd like to say thank you, Carol, Lesley, and Shawn, for being here and breaking it all down for us the way that you have. I'm going to open it up for questions. So who would like to, does anybody have any questions? Okay. Yeah, Gord?
Yeah, recently we, as a committee, we had social development and housing in, and we found out, and we know that they're behind on their annual reports, and I think Shawn just made reference to that. They came in and talked to us. Just wanted to know what other committees do in that case. We kind of left it as, okay, well, when you get your statements done, bring them in. And it was friendly, it was cordial, but are these typically happening with such a big file across the country, and should we be more on top of that?
Well, I think Carol would be much more qualified to answer that than I would. I can speak federally. I don't recall it ever happening, but Carol?
I'm sorry, can you just repeat the question?
There is an issue here with some of the Crown corporations and agencies not having their financial statements done on a timely basis. In fact, sometimes the auditor issues a report without that statement. The question was, is this happening in other jurisdictions?
So we're actually hearing quite a lot across the country about things going out on time. Like it's actually quite surprising how there's been an ability to get the statements out. Some slight delays, but nothing that significant. I would suspect that the reason for that might be, and I don't know enough about how you prepare the financial statements on a consolidated basis in PEI. But everybody does it a different way. Some jurisdictions wait until all the statements are in, and then they build up the consolidation. Others will take a draft, and then they'll work with that, and then they'll confirm it before they release with the final statements. And still others will estimate some of them. And you do have to do some cutoff things. For example, school districts in a lot of jurisdictions are on a different time frame than the public accounts, and you'll do cutoff things. So there's different ways of pulling them together. Everyone was scrambling at the very end, trying to get as much as they could get done. It wasn't easy for anybody. There's a lot of, across the country, a lot of stories about what has happened, but I haven't heard of a lot of major delays. But having said that, I've heard a lot of horror stories about how difficult it was.
Okay, thank you, Carol. Gord?
Yeah, and I mean, that's my question was kind of a little bit more specifically around, we went through the process as a public accounts. We had the organization, and it was social development and housing, which is a major concern here and across the country. And I mean, it was a good meeting. We asked them to, they're about 3 years behind, 2 or 3 years behind on their reporting. And it's hard for us to get a sense. And I found that with chatting with them, we just kind of suggested that they pick up the pace, but I didn't know if that was enough, you know? And I guess my question is, what do we do in public accounts to maybe strongly pick that up a little bit, and just where we are with accountability?
I can't think of another example across Canada, quite honestly, around a 2 to 3 year delay on anything. I just, you know, so again, I'm not familiar with what's behind that. I would, and again, I mean, easy for me to say, if I was on the Public Accounts Committee, I might ask the auditor to look into it and give us a good explanation of why, because that does sound more complex than just a basic delay. So that's, you know, there is that. In certain jurisdictions, you can request something of the auditor, and it's still up to the auditor to determine whether or not to do the work, but they may have some information that would be useful to you.
Great.
Thanks. Thank you, Gord. Any other questions? Hannah Bell?
Thank you, Chair. Following on from the previous, just in the unpacking today, you sort of shown how, particularly with Crown corporations, we only see a line item in the consolidated, and you have to kind of go through the layers to get to that some level of detail. And then when we add in the additional challenges of not having full financial statements, how is it that the auditor can then provide an opinion that these statements don't have any kind of conditions, when there is so much potentially real detail and information missing for such a significant part of the portfolio? I mean, I'm looking at I think the liability right now is in the hundreds of millions in that sort of suite of corporations. So I'm really baffled as to sort of where there isn't then a condition in terms of the Auditor General's summary.
So, if I'm understanding the question correctly, when I mentioned the debt number in the consolidated statement and said it does not include the crowns, it's not supposed to include the crowns. It's shown in a different manner. So that's common, it's normal, it's the way it is. But that debt number is showing in that schedule, and as a net, you can see what the overall equity impact is. And that is, again, recorded properly. So it was more to point out to you, if you're looking at the debt number and you think the Crown debt is in there, it's not. So you have to look to the two places. And again, that's the way the accounting standards decided to do it. There are some differences internationally. So if you hear about it from another country and they go, we don't do it that way, they do add it up. We don't do it like that in Canada. This is the way it's done. So it's not that it's missing, like it's not as though it isn't available or it hasn't been audited. It's been audited a different way. And then when you go to volume 3 and look up the actual statements for that organization, you'll see a separate audit report on those numbers. So they have been checked, they have been looked at, they have been combined appropriately. And so if there's something I said that made you, like when I said it wasn't there, I didn't mean it should be there. It isn't there. So just be aware of that.
Thank you, Carol. Hannah?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. It's I think it's particularly challenging, as I said, following from my colleagues' comments, that we don't often have the same level of detail or the timely access to detail to be able to make to be able to ask the right questions at the right time. So you spoke very much about the timeliness, but if we don't have those financial statements, then often, we're looking at trying to come up with sort of timely intervention way after the fact, because by the time those statements roll in, we're way past that point. And in the case of some of these Crown corporations, they are ones that have significant impact on activity outside public accounts in the policy space. So the activity of what's happening on a financial basis and getting clarity on that is important for the discussions that are happening in the other committees and in other activities. So you know, to my colleague's point, is the role of public accounts to sort of ensure that information is available here at the appropriate time. That's as much as important as the quality of the data itself, because of how it impacts everything else that's happening. You know, I'm thinking of the Housing Corporation or Health PEI or, you know, IIDI, which holds a huge amount of cash equity in terms of our immigration programs. These have really substantive impacts on other, you know, major parts of our activity.
It's quite common to see in audit reports and then discussions at Public Accounts Committee the timing of things. It's usually around a conversation around the release of the public accounts themselves. There are, if you go back many years, a lot of the jurisdictions in Canada did not have that entrenched in legislation. If you look at it today, most of them do. So there's a requirement to release the statements, whether it's within 3 months, 6 months, or, you know, I remember the days of it was a year late. That's rarely the case anymore, that it's really extended. But the best jurisdictions are moving up to a much tighter deadline. And then that flows to the Crowns themselves. The requirement for release is usually in the legislation governing that organization, not in a general piece of legislation. So it is a matter of going through each one to say, you know, what are the requirements for release, and are they meeting those requirements is an easy question to ask. But they may, in fact, not be, but there's no implications to it. They don't like it, so you didn't comply with the law, but so where are they? We need them. You are going to have that timing problem. You are going to get your next set of financial statements probably before you get your next Auditor General's report. It was quite convenient for today to give you the lineup of the what's in the statements and what did the auditor say about it, because both documents for 2019 year end are available. That won't always be the case. So you can think about when to schedule your hearing so that you wait, but then you're going to be in what you describe in terms of important things are happening and there's a delay before you get there. So it does that. What documents do you have to first look at? You're not going to have them all. So you're going to have to first just look at the statements. And I agree, that's way tougher than having the auditor's guide.
Hannah? Okay, great.
Thank you.
Gord?
Yeah, just a quick question. I mean, October 25th, 2019, the Blue Books were released last year. This year, they're not being released until January, and so that's a 15-month gap. And we understand that COVID has affected everybody. Is that concerning for the Public Accounts Committee? And are you seeing this trend across the country?
I feel like I'm a witness in your meeting. I can only speak to you know, again, the trend. I don't have it in a pragmatic audited fashion. I'm as I say, a lot of them managed to get it done pretty close to their original deadline, but there were delays right across the country. Otherwise, I think. Yeah, I can't answer the rest of that, sorry.
Oh, okay, thank
Gordon,
you.
thanks. And just to add on to that, this committee was made aware of that potential delay happening from the Auditor General when he was here to present on our annual, the 2020 report. And one other change that was made too is there was a change in the legislation to allow the Auditor General to report multiple times a year. So one of the other items that the AG had identified is that we'll probably see the financial audit section come out more timely to our blue books, which will be beneficial to us for sure, instead of having that 6-month gap. So I don't have anybody else on my list, but was there any other questions? Okay. So, oh, sorry, Carol.
So it was just on that topic. I have to, when I was in British Columbia, we issued the audit report on the public accounts a long time after the statements had come out, and the media just grilled me on it, and they were really tough on it, and I said, okay, next year we're getting it out right away. So we did all our work, and we literally wrote a report that came out the day, 2 days after the public accounts. Do you think the media ever noticed that? It was, so, you know, it takes time to pull things together. Often in the audit office, the same people are working on the audit of the financial statements as are then working on the report that has to go out. So their resources are an important factor as well.
And that's a very good point, Carol. I think often when we are critiquing, we forget that we can also critique in a good way, to say when changes have been made and progress has been made, that we actually acknowledge that, right? Because I think that that's a very important piece. When we go through our performance audits, we don't call the ones that have implemented 100% of the recommendations, right? So we don't give them the chance to sit in this chamber to say, we did this, and to celebrate that. And I think it's important that we also need to recognize that we need to be able to do those things as well. And Shawn, I just wanted to touch on one of your final suggestion. We have agreed as a committee that we're going to call the Liquor Commission to come as a witness, to just precisely for what you had suggested. So when we do that, in preparation of that meeting, do you have any suggestions, especially because we, depending on when it is scheduled, because it's not scheduled yet, so we likely, unless it's scheduled after the new blue books come out, it would be on the 2019 financials. Would you suggest that we wait until after the 2020 financials come out to actually have them come in? Or what would you suggest would be the best timing on that?
Well, firstly, you could ask the Liquor Commission if they have their own interim statements, instead of relying on the March 31st, 2019 statements. They would hopefully be preparing interim statements probably on a quarterly basis, if not monthly. So you can ask for that information, and again, I think it's a good idea just to get that information, just have a discussion with them as to how everything's going. It kind of reminds me of a letter that was the paper about 10 years ago. It was written by one of the political science professors at UPI, and he was basically suggesting that the PI Waste Management Corporation was not accountable. Well, they are accountable. They're accountable to the minister, and the minister is accountable to the Legislative Assembly, and the Legislative Assembly is accountable to the people of PEI. But they probably were never subject to a performance audit, and there was never any scandal, and everything probably worked good. But you can't make the assumption that they're not accountable. So a Crown Corporation like that, I think it's a good practice just to have them in. There's no scandals, there's no big issues, but just how are you getting along? How is your revenue compared to last year? Are you seeing any challenges as a result of COVID or anything else? Are you having challenges in nature? Just have a discussion with them, and it kind of adds to the accountability process that you are so intricately involved with.
Okay.
But I would ask for their own statements before the meeting.
Okay. All right, perfect. Any other thoughts from, sorry, Craig? Oh, go ahead, Lesley.
I just wanted to go back to Mr. McNeely's first question and just draw your attention again to the good practices on follow-up. And it sounds like you've had a committee in, you don't necessarily have all of the information you want from them, and that can be a good opportunity to one, as a committee, find out why you don't have that information. Is there a systemic problem that they're able to identify and talk to you about? Whether they are or they aren't, it's an opportunity for the committee to say, when can you have that information? And a good practice in terms of follow-up is to try and get commitment and get dates. So sometimes it's not an issue that the committee can say, okay, have us this information in 2 weeks or 2 months, but you can turn it back to that department and say, when are you able to prepare that information? And if they say, we'll have it to you in 6 months, then 6 months from there, you can follow up. It doesn't have to be a hearing, but follow up with a letter and say, do you have that information? Please submit it. And that lets the departments know that the committee is interested. They're on top of it. They want to ensure that accountability loop remains there. And typically, when this is happening, it's not something you have to do with every department, because once the word is out there that the committee is following up, they don't want one and dones, then the departments tend to stay on top of this information. And I say that not having the context of why that department may not have the information, but I do know in terms of good practices that can be a very effective way. And I'll also just draw your attention now. I know that in reading the public accounts, we touched on a lot of complex subjects and topics you may not be that familiar with, but we have prepared a quick reference sheet. This may look familiar to some of you who have seen these in the past on other topics, but we do have one on reading the public accounts with some key definitions and ideas, and that will be in your inbox shortly after this meeting. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Lesley. Okay, so was there any other closing statements or thoughts that you wanted to leave us with? And if not, you've left us with a lot already, of which we're very grateful for. So on behalf of the committee, sorry, Carol, did you want to say something?
I'm sorry, I thought you were asking your members. So you know, the only thing I will add, I do encourage you to talk to your own Auditor General, but the foundation is there if you have random questions about, you know, something we talked about, or if you go through what I've presented and say, I need to hear it again, please don't hesitate to contact us. Happy to answer your questions.
Great, appreciate that, Carol. So on behalf of the committee, I'd like to thank you for taking the time. Carol, thank you. I understand it's 4 hours in the difference between us, so really appreciate you. And we probably should have thought of that with the scheduling, but so grateful that you joined us today and walked us through that. The public accounts, I think it's very important for this committee, and I think we've taken away quite a bit. Lesley, as always, it's great to see you. Thank you very much. And Shawn, appreciate you coming in and joining us today. This has been great. So we'll take a short recess while we reset, and we will keep in touch for sure, and we appreciate the support from the Canadian Audit and Accountability Foundation and in the work that we're doing. So I will just mention you've given us some high praise, but that high praise is only because of, I would say, the good practices that you've shared with us and the training and the work that you've done with us. And so when you know what the good things to do are and being able to work as a committee to implement them, it really speaks volumes as to the work that your organization's doing. So thank you very much for being so supportive of us as we walk down this path. So have a great rest of the day. Thank you very much. And we're just going to take a quick recess. Thanks again. All right, so we'll resume today with public accounts. So item number 4 is new business. Does anybody have any new business that they'd like to bring forward? So just to follow up on Shawn's advice, would everybody be in favor of reaching out to the Liquor Commission and asking for their statements and then arranging a time for them to come in to present to us? However, asking for their financial statements in advance of the meeting. Is everybody okay with that? Sid? Oh,
Sorry. Also the Cannabis Management Corporation.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Decision, same request?
That's right, both of them, because it's the same, it's the same board, right?
Same board members.
Yeah. Sid?
So you said reach out to them, but haven't we done that already?
Ryan?
The committee's decision was that it would reach out, but would wait until after this training to do
Yeah.
so.
Okay, great. Any other thoughts? Okay, so we'll ask for both sets of financial statements in preparation. And we do have their annual reports, the last annual report as well, to reference. Was there any other items? We need to talk about a report, I guess, and about submitting a report to the legislature. So I assume we want to do an interim report. Is the committee in favor of that? We didn't do one last sitting, so are we in agreement that we'd like to do an interim report to the legislature? Sure, okay. So we will plan a in-camera meeting. I'll just talk to Ryan about the availability of the facilities, and we'll send out an option for a meeting. Okay, so if there's no other new business, I'll ask for a motion to adjourn. Robbie, thank you. Have a great day.